Introduction to Philosophy Part 3, Epistemology and Metaphysics. Although we went over the introduction to epistemology in the introduction to philosophy, I'll go through the basics of epistemology again to set the stage for this epistemology to follow. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy concerned with theories of knowledge, and it gets its, the term epistemology comes from episteme, meaning knowledge, and logos, meaning explanation. It's also sometimes translated as theory of knowledge, science of knowledge, study of knowledge. It is, to be rather repetitive, a rational and systematic attempt to understand epistemic terms, statements, principles, and theories. It involves an analysis of epistemic terms, concepts, principles, and theories. And of course, it involves creating and assessing these principles and theories, and applying these principles and theories to epistemic problems. Now, there are many classic problems in epistemology, some of which we'll look at in our brief section on epistemology, and others of which we will not look at because it's a very brief look. If you want to see more epistemology, there's also an epistemology class that's offered that spends the whole semester going over epistemology. One of the basic problems is the problem of skepticism, which is how do we establish that we can have knowledge? And it's kind of a good starting point because if we can't show that we can know things, it renders pretty much all the rest of epistemology a bit pointless. Now, skepticism comes in many varieties, as we'll see when we discuss skepticism. And these range from very limited forms of skepticism to truly radical skepticism, in which one doubts everything. Now, once we think we can get past the skeptic, sort of spoiler, we probably can't, we can start looking at the limits of knowledge, which involves determining what is knowable and what is not, what are unknown knowables, and what are unknown unknowables. We also need to distinguish between ignorance, a lack of knowledge, and belief, and actually knowing stuff. Now, there are some problems in epistemology that, fortunately, very fortunately, have become a matter of interest for Hollywood and also television, and also things like Netflix, etc. One of these is the classic problem of the external world, which is how do we know what we seem to be experiencing is real, that there's a really real world for real. And although Descartes did not originate this problem, he's the one that gets, pretty famous for presenting this problem in very extreme forms. The movie that most likely really got the notion of the problem of the external world into the public mind was the classic movie The Matrix. And there have been other movies like Inception and TV shows like The Good Place, which deal with either the broad problem of the external world or kind of smaller versions, like how do you know what you're experiencing really is what it seems to be. And so the problem of the external world is kind of a foundational problem, and solving it is essential to saying we know anything or almost anything about the world, because if there is no external world, we really can't know about it. Another problem of smaller scale is what's called the problem of other minds. How do we know other beings have minds? And this has also been popular in Hollywood and television in the various forms. A movie such as Ex Machina, for example, explicitly addressed this problem. Now, very abstractly, it's a question of, assuming that I know that I think and feel, how do I know that other beings I encounter also think and feel? A much more applied version, what can be considered applied or pragmatic epistemology, is how do I know what other people say or claim is actually what they're really thinking or feeling. So if someone says they're thinking this, or they claim they feel that, how do I know? And that's a problem for very applied epistemology. Getting back more to what we considered the more boring problems of epistemology, there's a problem of justification, what justifies a belief. Now, this can also actually be made interesting too in cases of like applied epistemology. So, for example, when people claim to, know the truth about a conspiracy that 5G is causing the coronavirus, which it does not, by the way, how can we say that these beliefs are unjustified? Or when someone makes a claim about anything, how can we say the belief is justified or not? And also a very practical example of this would be in the legal system. Namely, when people put forth evidence, there is the question of, is this evidence justified? Should we accept it as, true? There's also kind of abstractly, the problem of justified true belief, known as the Gettier problem. Now, going back to our good dead friend Plato, knowledge is often taken as belief that is justified and true, and the JTB model, justified true belief, dominated philosophy for a long time, until Gettier came along and supposedly showed that you could have a justified true belief without having knowledge. And if you want to see more of the Gettier problem, there's the epistemology class, or you can just look it up on YouTube. There are videos on that by other philosophers. Now, there are also many questions in epistemology, which include, what is knowledge? What can be known? How do we gain knowledge? How do we know there is an external world? How do we know if other people have minds? How do we know if God exists? Something we addressed in part 2. How do we distinguish dreaming from reality? What is an adequate justification for a belief? Are we obligated to examine our beliefs to see if they're correct or incorrect? And do people in positions of authority and power, do they have special obligations because of their power of influence to examine their beliefs to see if they're justified? What are the objects of knowledge? What is skepticism? Is it possible to refute the skeptic? Now, before concluding the introduction to epistemology, we'll take a look at some basic concepts. And again, if you've seen the introduction to philosophy, going over the branches of philosophy, or seen the part 2 talking about rationalism and empiricism, this will be a bit of a repeat. But I'm including here for those who have not seen that, or who would like to kind of recharge those memories. Now, philosophers, when it comes to knowing stuff, tend to split into two broad camps: the rationalist, who embrace rationalism, and the empiricist, who embrace empiricism. Rationalism is a view that at least some of our knowledge about the world is a priori. This is knowledge that we get through reason prior to or independent of experience. Now, there are some a priori truths that almost all philosophers, whether they're rationalists or empiricists, accept, such as logical and mathematical truths. So if you ask an empiricist, do triangles have three sides, they'd say, yeah, sure, you don't have to look. Where the dispute is, though, is whether you can know things about the world, whether things exist or not. And rationalists say, yes, at least some things. And empiricists say, nope, can't know anything about the world aside from what you get through empirical evidence. Now, some rationalists take truths about God, some even about metaphysics in general or ethics, to be a priori as well, that you just know them prior to experience. St. Anselm, for example, took this view. Descartes believes that certain metaphysical principles, like you can't get something from nothing, is a priori, that you don't have to go and get that through empirical experience. And some include ethics to be a priori as well. Rationalists, in general, although one could presumably claim to be a rationalist and reject innate ideas, they do tend to accept innate ideas. Those are ideas that are built in. And rationalists can disagree about what these ideas are and how they get in there. For example, many rationalists believe that God put them in there, wrote them on the soul. A rationalist, though, could be a complete atheist and say, nope, not God, it's something else. Could be built in metaphysically, or they could even be a physicalist, accepting that it's just somehow built into the structure of the nervous system. Some don't take fully formed ideas and they take these innate ideas to be more rational structures with logical categories in them. So the hallmarks of the rationalist are that first, they accept that you can know stuff a priori about the world. And secondly, they generally accept innate ideas. Stuff is built in. The empiricists are defined typically in terms of being not rationalist. So they believe that anything you know about the world, anything about existence, must have an empirical foundation. It's got to be a posteriori. It's not based in just pure reason. It's got to have an empirical foundation. Now, reason can be involved, of course, but the foundation has to ultimately be in the senses, empirical grounding. They also reject innate ideas. The mind is, in their Latin phrase, a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Now, as I mentioned before, kind of the starting point for general epistemology, and kind of a popularly accepted view, would be that you know something, if you believe it, which is the easy part, it's true, and it's justified. True means correct, although philosophers, as you would probably suspect, debate a great deal about what truth is. And there are all kinds of different theories of truth, ranging from kind of the classic correspondence theory of truth. True means, what you say matches the world, to much more elaborate, logical, constructs of truth. Justified, a belief is justified, means that it's adequately or properly grounded. And as you might imagine, philosophers fight about what it is to be justified. And there are a multitude of theories of justification. And if you want to see some of these, again, advertisement for the epistemology class. Now, beliefs could be true without being justified. You could just have a lucky guess, for example. And of course, on some accounts of justification, beliefs could be justified without being true. For example, inductive reasoning, if you accept, accepting a strong inductive argument as justifying a belief, you could have a really good inductive argument, but still end up with a belief that's not true. And that brings us to the end of the introduction to epistemology. And my barking dogs are barking us out.